So we have had the advantage this whole year of learning quite a lot about a particular kind of student at UAA. At least as a professor, I think I may have gained the most from reading some of Randy's research, review of literature research, and then toward the end, reading her about her personal experience. This is another project similar that Scott will recognize that began in a different direction than Ann did. Randy, I think, in the beginning was very interested in looking at deaf culture in Alaska Native villages, and then in doing interviews with the deaf students at UAA. But as I listened carefully to what Randy was saying, she had things to tell about her own experience that went beyond what we could learn by a real short-term study. And I was much more interested in having her develop, in her own words, a description of her own personal experience. I think you'll benefit also from hearing what Randy has to say.
Hi, my name is Randy Pascal. I'm a senior. I'm hopefully graduating next week. I'm going to talk about these things today. I'm going to talk about who I am, some pre-knowledge and background, my personal journey, my paper, the barriers, how to remove those barriers, research future, and special things and references. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and then moved here. My first language is American Sign Language. I'm from a genetically deaf family. I'm the third generation. I went to a deaf school in Buffalo, New York from 11 months until I was 18 and graduated. I then went to Gallaudet University, and now I'm here at UAA. I wanted to talk about some common assumptions. Being seen as a minority group, low literacy levels, and university standards. I'm going to talk about each one of these things. First, deaf people tend to be labeled as a minority based on their inability to hear. We are not labeled based on our culture, which is a different language and different traditions and backgrounds and traditions. And also, deaf and hard of hearing students tend to get a low level of education and are not prepared for college. Most have a 4th grade reading level, and only a few get past the 7th grade level at all. That tends to be why they cannot meet the university standards for education, and most are not prepared for college at all. Deaf teens tend to be put into 2 groups, those that attended deaf schools and those that are mainstream. Deafs tend to have direct access to information through sign language, whereas mainstream, they are a deaf student in a hearing culture and hearing classroom. I have got to experience both of these things. There's 2 ways to identify deaf. There's a capital D and a lowercase d. I want to explain the difference to you. Capital D tends to focus on the cultural aspects of deafness. The lowercase d tends to be based on non-cultural access, meaning they can't hear and they can't talk. That's the difference. That I tend to label myself as a capital D and not a lowercase d, which is based on an autological condition of not being able to hear. information, even though when a hearing person reads that, they see deaf as hearing impaired. I can't talk, I can't hear, but for me, deaf is about the culture. My family uses American Sign Language. I went to a deaf school that used American Sign Language. I came here to the University of Alaska, and that was my first experience being in a hearing environment as a deaf student. And that's what inspired me to write this research paper. I wanted to see the comparison between being in a deaf school and being in a mainstream school. My research for the past year has really focused on myself as a deaf student being here at the University of Alaska, using English as a second language, depending on disability support services for interpreters, transcripts, and note takers, and became a very important part of my education. I got my information for this project from research that I did, support from disability support services and their website, from educational articles and journals. They tend to talk about deaf bilingual education, mainstream interpreting issues, and those kinds of things. I identified several barriers. Education access, mode of communication, the resource availability for deaf students, and cultural differences. Before I explain those, I would like to give you some information, background information with this quote. Traditionally, deaf people have been taught written English in the same way as hearing people. But this puts them at a disadvantage because English is not their native language. It's a second language. American Sign Language is their first language. Now I'm going to go back and talk about these barriers. Education access. My information comes through an interpreter and not directly from the teacher. English and ASL are not equal modes of communication. There's not a word to sign relationship. Some of the vocabulary can be lost in the translation from a teacher to interpreter to me. Then when I see it on a test, there's vocabulary there I don't recognize. I know that deaf students have difficulty accessing resources. The University of Alaska has a writing lab, and many hearing people can do walk-ins. I have to figure out how to get an interpreter, get an advanced appointment, and we go together. It's not that I can go in anytime. Also, here at the library, perhaps my group wants to get together at 9 o'clock at night and discuss a project. Again, I don't have the benefit of having an interpreter. Cultural differences. I have several examples. I'm just going to mention a few. One is in a classroom setting, a situation that can be very frustrating. A teacher wants to show a movie, and the movie has no captions, and they turn off the lights, and I cannot see the interpreter, and I am left in the dark. So that's one. Now I want you to understand the cultural difference. I'm going to have the interpreter turn off their voice so that you can experience this cultural difference. See, for those of you that do not know sign, you're wondering why they're all laughing. You're missing what they are experiencing. That is what I experience every day at UAA. I miss that information, and that has been my experience here. I want to talk about removing these barriers, especially for these three important things. I think it's important to educate the deaf and hard of hearing students on how to use interpreters. They may get an interpreter that they don't really like, and they feel like they have to keep that person. They need to know that they can pick interpreters that fit them and fit their educational style, and advocate for themselves. We can also talk to them more about the resources that UAA has, explain what services are available here, like the writing lab. I didn't really know until this last semester. I was like, oh, the writing lab has this available for me, and I didn't know that this whole time. Also, educating faculty on campus on how to use interpreters. Not saying to the interpreter, please tell her, please tell him, because then I don't understand why they're not talking to me. So educating professors how to use interpreters, I think that was a very important part of removing some of these barriers. This quote at the bottom is very interesting. Even with a highly qualified interpreter, full access to the content and social life in hearing classroom can be challenging, and there are many aspects of the educational placement that can affect success. If I could do more research, this is what I would want to do. Interview deaf and hard of hearing students, get their perspective. Interview the interpreters. Talk with DSS, the staff, and the teachers, and figure out their perspective on deaf and hard of hearing students. Compare the program here with other small deaf programs in other universities. Get more support for my research because English is my second language, and this has been quite a challenge. I want to say thank you to the interpreters for their many, many hours of being with me, especially Anne Lazenby, Natalie Page, Rachel Day, Rachel Hollander, Gina Ashman, and Connie Salvador. Professor Ann Jackie for her dedication, support, and patience with my research process through this semester. And my capstone classmates, they've been wonderful feedback, ideas, and discussion. And the endless support from my sister, my friend Sonia, the Gates family, and the Peterson family, who are here. Any questions?
I have a question. How would you describe your overall experience at UAA as a deaf person? Do you feel like you've missed out socially at all, or do you feel your fellow students have been open to learning ASL or gesturing or just being open to you as a person? How would you describe that?
I grew up in a deaf family. I mentioned that when I started my presentation. I went to Gallaudet University, that's the first deaf and hard of hearing university in the world. So, and then when I came here and started in a mainstream university, I had no idea what that was going to look like. I really found myself alone really quickly. I thought, who am I going to talk to? I thought I would just be with the interpreter all the time because they can sign. So, I mean, you really can't do that. That's not their job to keep me company. So, I started to, I would say I still feel alone even though I'm a senior. I have a few friends here and there through classes, because we were assigned to work in groups, we've developed kind of a relationship, but in general, I think I'm still alone. And the second part of your question, socially, it's hard. I just set up interpreters to go to theater or be involved, so I feel like, oh, that's too much trouble. So, and getting communication access, I don't really have the motivation to do that. If I want to go do something, then I have to get DSS to provide an interpreter and go through that. And usually they can't get something set up last minute. So sometimes interpreters are available, sometimes not. So it's not easy.
I know you spoke about some discrimination because of your disabilities. have stood against all of them as far as being where you are. How much is this affecting other people like you who haven't had the same chance as you have?
I'm doing this paper because I really see some deaf and hard of hearing students that don't know what they can do. I see them, and I've seen them been in a situation where they've already experienced being in a hearing school. So maybe they don't understand what the difference is between having complete, full access to an education. They're used to it coming through an interpreter. And it's like, oh, high school and UAA are the same, that's okay. But for myself, I grew up in a deaf family, strong deaf culture, deaf university, deaf rights, advocating for myself, and so I want to encourage them to do that, to advocate for themselves. Again, the socializing part, I don't know that it makes a difference. Does that answer your question?
I'm especially interested in how frustration is dealt with in classes, especially when you're listening to birds singing, music playing, and discussing the emotional impact of those things.
Well, being here in a hearing university, I mean, obviously it doesn't match me, I have special needs, but I mean, I expect the classes to operate normally as they would even if I wasn't there, whether hearing or deaf. I found it very fascinating. I mean, really, you get a good interpreter in there that can talk about the details of what it sounds, and I found that really fascinating and enjoyed it. But if that class was like a full semester of all sounds, I wouldn't enjoy that, music or sounds. I probably wouldn't sign up for something like that in the first place. I won't sign up for any music classes. If I sign up really caring, would go crazy trying to figure out how to interpret this. So I'm just going to avoid that.
How do you think that the colleges do a better job as far as registration is concerned when they get a deaf student? What things could they do differently to let these students know about all the accessibilities that the college has to offer?
That's a good question. Because I'm a senior and I still have a problem with registration, knowing figure out what to do and how to sign up for graduation, and haven't even figured all that out. As a first timer getting into school, I would say getting them what they need to know right away. What can UAA do specifically? Let me think. I filled out my application, and they said, do you need any special services? And I put down I'm deaf, and I need American Sign Language interpreter. And from there, DSS contacted me, and it's, we're DSS, and these are the things we can do for you, and make an appointment, and sit down, and from there it was okay. But I think it's important to explain while they're in high school. Have an open house. Talk about those things. Some students don't realize that they're hard of hearing, perhaps, or that they can get transcripts, or they can have other kinds of access. And DSS is not only about deaf and hard of hearing. They have a long list of services. So, and maybe who they can contact at DSS and how to get involved on campus and using DSS services.
Randy, what are you going to do after you graduate next week? What are your plans now?
Sleep. First, I'm going to sleep. Really, I'm looking forward to graduation. And then I'm going to go to my sister's wedding in 2 weeks. And this fall, I've decided to take 6 months off. I'm going to move back to the East Coast, go to Gallaudet University, and look into their graduate program for sign language. And adjust to life on the East Coast. I got a job offer being outreach coordinator in Boston for the Inner City School for the Deaf. And I thought that'd be a great program except I really want 6 months off, so I don't know. So, and I was thinking about going to Nepal in October for a month to help an old college roommate who's deaf and blind, and I'm gonna be her support services and guide her around Nepal. So I'm gonna be an advocate for her for a month in October, so that's really my plan so far. So, and then another 2 years of college probably. But I'm looking forward to getting back to a deaf world at Gallaudet.
I say, really interesting story. I find it really fascinating, especially where you're talking about coming from the residential schools that are in a deaf community and a university from like that, and then coming in here in a mainstream environment, and then you're talking about taking that outreach position. What do you think that transition from the deaf community and that university to a mainstream university like this, was there a transition process that they provided for you to kind of orientate yourself to a mainstreaming process, or is that something that you think should be more provided there, or do you think it doesn't really matter, or is that something that you're going to provide with that outreach program?
I see hearing people every day, so I already know how to transition myself to get around. But I think the outreach position is for K-12 in Boston. It's inner city. And you're talking about Gallaudet and how they could do outreach, is that what you're meaning? Really, Gallaudet just focuses on a college there. They do internships, job experience, everything, just like any other college. But if you need to go out in the community, they can get you an interpreter. But Gallaudet University, most of their internships tend to be like government, USDA, different branches of the government, Congress. It's like 5 minutes from the White House. So there's a lot of government jobs available in that area. Politics. I do want to mention, I had never been in mainstream environments at all, until until I was 25 or 30. But really coming here made me realize those kids who grow up in a mainstream environment watching interpreters a whole life, that's going to be tough. It's tough enough for me here for 4 years. We have to really respect those people that grew up in a mainstream environment. And I think it's important that they get that exposure to deaf culture as well, even though they're growing up with interpreters.
One question. Your project ended up in a very interesting place, and to turn that compliment into a question, how did you feel about having to change direction from where your project had been going?
It was a challenge. I did 6 months research, pretty much threw that out and started over. So I did 2 semesters in 1 semester. That's what it felt like. Really, the research about deaf schools when I started my research about deaf schools in America in another class with Professor Jackie, and when I got done with that semester, I thought, wow, I really like that concept, and I thought maybe I could expand on that. And then I thought maybe that's too big, it's hard to find a lot of information about Alaska rural schools. I found 2 articles. So, and I thought that is not going to support an entire research paper. So I thought maybe this was better. I thought, wait a minute, maybe I could use this opportunity and my experience to help change the future for other deaf and hard of hearing students coming to UAA.